Time is a thief that steals a woman's youth with quiet, invisible footsteps. But only a truly foolish man believes that youth is the only thing a woman has of value. Beatrice Vance understood this truth on a rainy Tuesday evening, exactly 2 weeks before her 48th birthday. She was sitting in the grand, mahogany-paneled dining room of the London townhouse she had spent 25 years turning into a respectable home. Across the long, polished table sat Alistair, her husband. He was a wealthy textile merchant, a man whose fortune Beatrice had helped build with her own tireless labor, shrewd advice, and silent sacrifices during their early, poverty-stricken years. But as the antique grandfather clock ticked in the corner, Alistair did not look at her with the gratitude of a true partner. He looked at her with the cold, calculated impatience of a man discarding an old coat. He cleared his throat, wiped his mouth with a linen napkin Beatrice had hand-embroidered, and delivered the sentence that would end her world. He was leaving her. The reason was not a sudden financial ruin or a tragic shift in circumstances. The reason was standing in the foyer, a 22-year-old girl named Clara, whose only accomplishments were a flawless complexion and a naive, adoring laugh. Alistair's voice was completely devoid of guilt. He spoke of the separation as if it were a mere business transaction. He explained that a man of his current stature required a wife who could provide fresh vitality to his social standing. Beatrice listened in absolute silence. The sheer indignity of the moment threatened to suffocate her. She looked at her own hands resting on the table, hands that bore the faint, permanent scars of sewing his first inventory by candlelight when they had absolutely nothing. "I am not an unreasonable man, Beatrice," Alistair said, leaning back in his expensive leather chair. "I will not leave you entirely destitute. I have prepared the legal documents. You will receive a modest monthly stipend sufficient for a woman of your quiet habits. Furthermore, I am transferring the deed of the Briarwood property into your name. It is a remote apple orchard in the northern valleys. It hasn't produced a harvest in a decade, but the farmhouse is structurally sound. You can live out your days there, away from the gossip of the city." He was burying her. That was the reality. He was sending her to a forgotten, barren piece of land so he wouldn't have to look at the living reminder of his own aging, so his new young bride wouldn't be troubled by Beatrice's existence. If you have ever felt discarded by someone you poured your entire heart and soul into, if you know the bitter pain of being replaced, please leave a like on this video. It is time to show the world that a woman's worth does not expire with her youth. Beatrice did not throw her wine glass. She did not fall to her knees and beg him to remember the vows they had taken in a freezing chapel 25 years ago. She had far too much pride to let Clara, who was undoubtedly listening by the door, hear her cry. Instead, Beatrice stood up slowly. Her posture was completely straight, her expression an unreadable mask of cold, terrifying dignity. "You may keep your monthly stipend, Alistair," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a low, steady register that made him blink in surprise. "I will take the deed to Briarwood and nothing else. I do not want a single coin that has been touched by your betrayal." "Don't be dramatic, Beatrice," Alistair scoffed, rolling his eyes. "You have never worked a day of hard labor in your life. You will freeze in the country without my money." "I built you, Alistair," Beatrice replied quietly, her dark eyes locking onto his. "When we met, you had nothing but a ruined cart and a head full of dreams. I built your business. I built this home. Do not ever make the mistake of thinking I cannot build something without you." She turned her back on him and walked out of the dining room. She walked past the young, wide-eyed Clara in the foyer without granting the girl a single glance. Beatrice climbed the grand staircase, packed a single leather trunk with her simplest, warmest woolen dresses, and left the silver, the jewels, and the fine silk gowns behind. She walked out into the freezing London rain, carrying her own trunk, and hailed a carriage to the train station. She was 48 years old, her heart was shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, and she was heading into the absolute unknown. But as the train lurched forward, leaving the glowing gas lamps of the city behind, Beatrice Vance did not cry. She looked out at the dark, rolling countryside, and a cold, fierce fire ignited in her chest. Alistair thought he had discarded her. He didn't know he had just set her free. The journey to the northern valleys took 3 exhausting days. The train ride gave way to a cramped, rattling stagecoach, which eventually deposited Beatrice at a muddy crossroads miles from any real civilization. From there, she paid a local farmer a silver coin, one of the few she had left in her purse, to drive her the remaining distance to Briarwood in the back of a hay wagon. The air here was entirely different from the heavy, coal-choked atmosphere of London. It was sharp, violently cold, and smelled of wet earth and pine needles. As the wagon crested a steep, rocky hill, the driver pointed a calloused finger toward a sprawling valley below. "There it is, ma'am. Briarwood Orchard. Though I reckon it's more briar than wood these days." Beatrice looked down and her breath caught in her throat. The estate was not merely neglected. It looked as though it had been cursed. Hundreds of apple trees stood in crooked skeletal rows, their branches bare and twisted like the arthritic fingers of old men reaching for the gray sky. The tall, yellowed grass had completely swallowed the paths. In the center of the decaying orchard stood the farmhouse. It was a large stone and timber structure that might have been beautiful a century ago, but now the roof sagged under the weight of wet moss, the wooden shutters hung off their hinges, and the wide front porch was half collapsed. Alistair had not given her a home. He had given her a graveyard. The farmer helped her lower her heavy leather trunk onto the muddy ground near the rusted iron gate. He looked at her with a mixture of pity and skepticism. A refined woman in a dark, tailored traveling dress standing alone in the wilderness was a sight that made no sense to him. "Will you be all right out here, Mrs. Vance? The nearest neighbor is Gideon Black, the cooper, and he lives a mile up the ridge. He's not exactly the sociable type either." "I will be perfectly fine, thank you," Beatrice said, her voice betraying none of the absolute terror clenching her stomach. She tipped him another coin and the wagon rattled away, leaving her entirely alone in the sweeping silence of the valley. Beatrice stood at the gate for a long time. The freezing wind whipped at her woolen skirts, tearing strands of dark hair from her neat bun. She looked at the dead trees, the rotting wood, and the overwhelming scale of the ruin. The sheer cruelty of Alistair's gift washed over her. He had expected her to arrive here, take one look at this monumental decay, and come crawling back to the city to beg for his stipend. He expected her to admit defeat. A bitter, humorless smile touched Beatrice's lips. She picked up the heavy leather handle of her trunk and began the slow, agonizing drag up the overgrown path toward the farmhouse. The mud sucked at her boots and the thorny briars snatched at her dress, as if the land itself was testing her resolve. By the time she reached the broken steps of the porch, her arms were trembling with exhaustion, and she was gasping for the thin, freezing air. She pushed open the heavy oak door. It screamed on rusted hinges, revealing an interior that was exactly as desolate as the outside. The floors were thick with dust and dead leaves. The massive stone hearth was cold and filled with the ashes of fires that had burned out a decade ago. Cobwebs hung like thick gray curtains from the wooden beams above. The silence inside the house was profound, heavy with the weight of abandonment. Beatrice walked to the center of the room. She set her trunk down. She slowly unbuttoned her fine tailored traveling coat, the last vestige of her wealthy city life, and folded it neatly over a dusty wooden chair. She looked down at her hands. They were pale, soft from years of luxury, trembling slightly in the cold. But beneath the skin the bones were strong. If you have ever had to rebuild your life from scratch, knowing that the journey ahead would be the hardest thing you've ever done, leave a comment telling us where you found your strength. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of powerful women. She walked over to the fireplace, her eyes scanning the room until she spotted an old, rusted iron broom leaning in a dark corner. He picked it up. The handle was rough and splattered with old paint. Beatrice gripped it tightly. She walked to the center of the dusty floor, squared her shoulders and took the first forceful sweep. A cloud of ancient dust rose into the air, catching the pale light filtering through the dirty windows. It was a small, insignificant action in the face of such massive ruin. But as the stiff bristles scraped against the hardwood, it sounded like a battle cry. The past was dead. Her new life had just begun. The first 3 weeks at Briarwood Orchard were a brutal, unforgiving trial of endurance. Beatrice quickly learned that survival in the northern valleys did not care about her past life of velvet cushions or afternoon teas. Survival only cared about the blisters on her hands, the strength in her back, and the amount of dry wood she could drag into the house before the sun dipped below the jagged horizon. Her fine woolen dresses were soon stained with soot and mud, her knuckles were raw and every muscle in her body ached with a deep, persistent fire. Yet every morning when the freezing cold seeped through the thin blankets and threatened to paralyze her, Beatrice thought of Alistair's mocking smile. That memory alone was enough to force her feet onto the freezing floorboards. She was determined to fix the farmhouse, starting with the gaping hole in the roof that let the winter rain pour directly into the kitchen. But determination could not overcome the sheer physical limitation of a heavy, waterlogged oak beam that had collapsed across the rafters. Beatrice had spent 2 agonizing hours trying to leverage it with a rusted iron crowbar, her breath coming in ragged, white plumes in the cold air. The beam refused to budge. Her hands were bleeding, her shoulders screaming in protest. Frustration, hot and bitter, finally brought tears to her eyes. Not tears of sorrow but of pure, helpless anger. She dropped the crowbar. The metallic clang echoed sharply across the desolate yard. "You are using the wrong pivot point, Mrs. Vance." The voice was deep, rough, and entirely unexpected. Beatrice spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Standing at the edge of the porch, emerging from the thick morning mist like a phantom of the forest, was a man. He was tall, remarkably broad-shouldered, and dressed in heavy, weathered canvas and leather. His hair was thick and dark, heavily threaded with silver, and a dense, neatly trimmed beard covered his jaw. He carried a massive bundle of freshly cut lumber on one shoulder as easily as if it were a stack of kindling. "I am Gideon Black," he said, setting the lumber down on the grass with a heavy thud. "I live up the ridge. The wagon driver mentioned a woman from London had been left out here to freeze. I came to see if you had the good sense to go back to the city yet." Beatrice quickly wiped her eyes, her spine instantly snapping straight. She lifted her chin, calling upon every ounce of the formidable dignity she had cultivated over 25 years. "I am not going back to the city, Mr. Black. Not today and not ever. I appreciate your concern, but I am perfectly capable of managing my own property." Gideon looked at her. His eyes, a striking shade of pale, stormy gray, swept over her mud-stained dress, her bleeding hands, and the massive, unmovable oak beam she had been fighting. He did not laugh. He did not offer a patronizing smile. He simply nodded slowly, recognizing the fierce, unyielding pride of a woman who had drawn her line in the dirt. "I see that," Gideon murmured, stepping up onto the porch. His heavy boots made the rotting wood groan. "But leverage is a matter of physics, not pride. If you push from that angle, the beam will snap back and break your collarbone." He walked past her, the scent of fresh pine, wood smoke, and cold air trailing behind him. He picked up the iron crowbar, wedged it beneath a different joint, and put his massive weight against it. The muscles in his back strained against his heavy shirt. With a loud, protesting crack, the waterlogged beam shifted, rolling safely away from the fragile roof structure and crashing to the floor. Beatrice stared at him, momentarily speechless. He turned back to her, leaning the crowbar against the wall. "The roof needs new shingles and the chimney flashing is rusted through," Gideon stated, his tone purely practical. "The next snowstorm will bury this kitchen. I have spare lumber and tar at my workshop. I will bring it down tomorrow." "I cannot pay you, Mr. Black," Beatrice said sharply, her pride flaring again. "My husband made sure I arrived here with nothing. I will not accept charity." Gideon paused at the edge of the porch. He looked back at her, his pale eyes studying the fierce, beautiful defiance in her face. "I don't offer charity, Mrs. Vance. My winter coats need mending and I haven't eaten a loaf of bread that didn't taste like sawdust in 5 years. You fix my coats and bake the bread, I fix your roof. It is a trade between neighbors." He didn't wait for her to answer. He turned and walked back into the mist, leaving Beatrice standing in the cold kitchen. For the first time since she had left London, she felt a genuine spark of hope. If you love seeing a strong woman find a true, respectful partner who recognizes her worth, leave a like right now. Comment below if you think Gideon is already 100 times the man Alistair ever was. The arrangement between Beatrice and Gideon quickly evolved from a simple trade into a quiet, heavily relied-upon partnership. Over the next month, the desolate silence of Briarwood Orchard was replaced by the steady, comforting sounds of restoration. Gideon arrived every morning with his tools and a quiet, imposing presence that made Beatrice feel remarkably safe. He repaired the sagging roof, replaced the shattered window panes, and reinforced the front porch. In return, Beatrice transformed the interior of the farmhouse. Using the flour, salt, and venison Gideon provided, she cooked meals that filled the cold house with warm, rich aromas. She mended his heavy work clothes with the precise, invisible stitches she had perfected years ago, finding a strange comfort in the domestic rhythm. They spoke very little at first. Gideon was a man who measured his words carefully, harboring a deep distrust of the world outside his mountain ridge. But as the weeks turned into months, a profound mutual respect began to blossom between them. Gideon watched Beatrice scrub floors until her knees bruised, never complaining, never asking for pity. He saw the fierce intelligence in her dark eyes, the way she organized the chaotic ledger of his cooperage business within an hour, and he realized that the man who had abandoned her was an absolute fool. Beatrice, in turn, saw beneath Gideon's gruff exterior. She saw the gentle way he handled injured wildlife, the deep sorrow hiding in his stormy gray eyes, and the quiet, protective shadow he cast over her new life. One crisp, clear afternoon, as the harsh winter began to yield to the first tentative signs of spring, Gideon took Beatrice walking through the sprawling, overgrown apple orchard. The twisted, skeletal trees looked like a vast army of the dead, choking beneath thick blankets of thorny briars and invasive vines. Beatrice looked out over the rolling hills of the property, a deep sadness settling over her. "It is a shame," Beatrice murmured, pulling her repaired woolen shawl tightly around her shoulders. "Alistair told me the orchard hadn't produced a harvest in a decade. He gave it to me because he knew it was completely dead." Gideon stopped walking. He knelt beside a massive twisted apple tree, pulling a heavy hunting knife from his belt. He didn't speak. He simply grabbed a thick, suffocating vine of briar that was strangling the trunk and sliced cleanly through it, pulling the parasitic weed away. Then, using the tip of his knife, he carefully scraped away a tiny patch of the tree's gray, weathered bark. He looked up at her, gesturing for her to come closer. Beatrice knelt in the cold, damp earth beside him. Beneath the dead, gray exterior, the wood was a vibrant, healthy pale green. It was moist. It was alive. "They aren't dead, Beatrice," Gideon said softly, his deep voice rumbling in the quiet orchard. "They are just suffocating. These are imperial russets and northern spies. Heritage apples. They are some of the strongest, most resilient trees on earth. The previous owner simply stopped pruning them, let the briars take over, and the trees went dormant to survive. They shut themselves down because nobody was taking care of them." He looked directly into her eyes, the meaning of his words hanging heavy and profound in the cold air. The parallel was impossible to ignore. Like the trees, Beatrice had been neglected, starved of affection, and suffocated by a man who refused to nurture her. She had gone dormant to survive. "If we cut back the dead wood," Gideon continued, his gaze never leaving hers, "if we clear the briars and let the sunlight reach the roots, these trees will wake up. And when they do, they won't just produce a few apples. After resting for 10 years, the soil here is incredibly rich. The harvest will be massive. This orchard could produce the finest cider and preserves in the entire country." Beatrice stared at the tiny patch of green wood, her heart beginning to hammer violently against her ribs. Alistair had given her this property as a cruel joke. He thought he was handing her a pile of ashes. He had no idea he had handed her a sleeping gold mine. "Can you teach me how to prune them?" Beatrice asked, her voice breathless with sudden, overwhelming realization. "Can we save them?" Gideon smiled. A rare, incredibly handsome smile that reached his pale gray eyes and transformed his entire face. "It will be backbreaking work. We will have to clear hundreds of trees by hand before the spring thaw." "I am not afraid of hard work, Gideon," Beatrice said, her dark eyes flashing with a fierce, brilliant light. "I built an empire for a man who didn't deserve it. Now I am going to build one for myself." Beatrice just discovered the secret to her revenge. If you are excited to see her turn this dead orchard into a multi-million-dollar empire, type "empire" in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to follow this incredible journey. The months that followed were a testament to the sheer, unbreakable will of a woman who had been told she was worthless. The winter in the northern valleys was brutal, refusing to loosen its icy grip, but Beatrice and Gideon matched its ferocity with their own relentless labor. They worked from the moment the pale sun breached the horizon until the evening shadows swallowed the valley. Pruning a single neglected apple tree was an exhausting task. Pruning 500 of them seemed like sheer madness. But Beatrice refused to surrender. She wore a heavy canvas coat that Gideon had altered for her, her hands protected by thick leatherwork gloves. Together they moved row by agonizing row. Gideon wielded a heavy iron saw, cutting through the massive deadwood branches that were suffocating the canopy. Beatrice followed with sharp pruning shears, painstakingly clearing the parasitic briars and cutting back the smaller, diseased limbs to expose the healthy greenwood beneath. Her body transformed during those long, freezing weeks. The soft, pampered hands of the London merchant's wife were gone. Her grip became like iron, her shoulders grew strong, and her stamina rivaled that of the hardened mountain men. But the most profound change was in her spirit. With every dead branch she cut away, Beatrice felt as though she was cutting away a piece of her painful past. She was pruning Alistair's condescension, Clara's mocking youth, and the decades of silent servitude. She was stripping herself down to the strong living core. Gideon watched this transformation with a quiet, profound awe. He had spent his life surrounded by the rugged beauty of the wilderness, but he had never seen anything as magnificent as Beatrice Vance fighting for her own survival. They developed a silent, seamless choreography in the orchard. He knew exactly when she needed him to pull a heavy branch out of her way, and she knew exactly when to step back as his heavy saw came crashing through the timber. When they paused at midday to drink hot tea from a metal thermos, sitting side by side on a pile of freshly cut wood, the silence between them was no longer heavy with grief or suspicion. It was warm. It was the comfortable, deep silence of absolute partnership. As March slowly gave way to April, the cruel winter finally broke. The freezing rains turned into gentle, warm showers. The soil of Briarwood Orchard, enriched by 10 years of undisturbed decay and falling leaves, drank in the moisture greedily. And then the miracle happened. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Small, tight green buds appeared on the scarred, twisted branches they had fought so hard to save. A week later, those buds began to swell. And on a surprisingly warm Tuesday morning, Beatrice walked out onto the front porch with her morning coffee and stopped dead in her tracks. The valley had transformed overnight. The skeletal, terrifying graveyard of dead trees had vanished. In its place was an absolute, breathtaking ocean of white and pale pink blossoms. The sheer volume of the flowers was staggering, a testament to the massive pent-up energy of the heritage trees that had been waiting a decade to breathe. A gentle breeze swept through the valley, carrying the sweet, intoxicating fragrance of millions of apple blossoms up to the farmhouse. It was a smell of pure, undeniable victory. Beatrice dropped her coffee mug. It shattered on the porch, but she didn't care. She ran down the wooden steps, her skirts flying, and rushed into the center of the orchard. She stood beneath the massive canopy of a northern spy tree, completely surrounded by a blizzard of falling pink petals. For the first time since Alistair had coldly dismissed her across that mahogany dining table, Beatrice Vance threw her head back and laughed. It was a loud, joyous, beautiful sound that echoed across the ridge. Gideon emerged from the tree line, stopping to stare at the incredible sight. He didn't look at the millions of blossoms. He looked only at Beatrice, bathed in the morning sunlight, laughing in the center of her reborn empire. If you believe that hard work and resilience always bring a beautiful harvest, hit the like button right now. Seeing Beatrice laugh again is the greatest victory. Let us know in the comments if you are cheering for her. He walked slowly toward her, his heavy boots crushing the fallen petals. Beatrice turned to him, her face radiant, her dark eyes shining with happy tears. "We did it, Gideon," she whispered, breathless, reaching out to touch a cluster of white blossoms. "They are alive." Gideon stepped close to her, his towering frame providing a comforting shelter against the morning breeze. He reached out, his rough, calloused fingers gently brushing a stray pink petal from her dark hair. "I never doubted it for a second," he murmured, his deep voice thick with emotion. "You brought this place back to life, Beatrice, just like you brought me back to life." While the roots of Briarwood Orchard were drinking in the spring rain and preparing for a miraculous rebirth, the foundation of Alistair Vance's empire in London was beginning to rot. Alistair sat in his lavish, smoke-filled office overlooking the bustling mercantile district, staring at a leather-bound ledger that made absolutely no sense. For 25 years, Beatrice had managed the complex accounting of his textile business. She had a brilliant, meticulous mind for numbers, catching discrepancies that his paid clerks constantly missed. She knew which suppliers to trust, which shipping routes were the most cost-effective, and exactly when to tighten their budget to weather an economic downturn. Alistair had always assumed her work was simple, women's work easily replaced by a young clerk. He had been spectacularly, devastatingly wrong. Without Beatrice's quiet, invisible hand guiding the finances, the business was bleeding money. 2 major shipments of raw silk had been ruined because a clerk had booked a cheap, unverified freighter to save costs. A mistake Beatrice never would have allowed. Creditors were beginning to send polite but firm letters. The fortune Alistair thought was invincible was quickly proving to be incredibly fragile. And then there was Clara. His young, beautiful new wife was exactly what he had asked for. A vibrant, flawless ornament for his arm at high society galas. But Clara knew absolutely nothing about sacrifice, patience, or building a life. She only knew how to spend. She demanded new silk gowns weekly, completely redecorated the London townhouse with expensive French furniture, and threw lavish, exhausting parties that kept Alistair awake until the early hours of the morning. When Alistair finally attempted to gently suggest they curtail their spending due to the recent shipping losses, Clara had thrown a terrifying, dramatic tantrum, accusing him of trapping her in a miserable, impoverished life. Alistair rubbed his throbbing temples, looking at the chaotic numbers in the ledger. The silence in his office was oppressive. He looked at the empty chair across from his desk, the chair where Beatrice used to sit, calmly explaining their financial strategy while sipping tea. A sudden, sharp pang of regret pierced his chest. He pushed it down immediately, his pride refusing to acknowledge the catastrophic mistake he had made. He convinced himself that Beatrice was likely freezing and starving in the northern ruins, regretting the day she walked out on his money. But Alistair Vance had no idea what was happening in the north. By late September, the crisp autumn air of the valley was heavy with a scent so sweet and rich it almost felt intoxicating. The harvest at Briarwood Orchard had not just been successful, it had been historic. The heritage trees, having rested and gathered nutrients in the rich soil for 10 years, produced an unbelievable yield. The branches were bowing under the massive weight of thousands upon thousands of perfect, gigantic imperial russet and northern spy apples. Their skins were a flawless, vibrant crimson and deep gold, crisp and bursting with a complex, honeyed flavor that modern, overfarmed orchards could not replicate. Beatrice stood on the front porch of the farmhouse, which was now fully restored, painted, and weatherproofed. She held a clipboard in her hand, managing a small army of local workers. Gideon had traveled to the nearby villages, hiring 24 men and women to help bring in the massive harvest. Wagons pulled by sturdy draft horses lined the main path, being loaded with heavy wooden crates overflowing with perfect fruit. "We have 3 buyers from the city arriving by train tomorrow, Beatrice," Gideon called out, walking up to the porch. He was carrying a massive crate of apples on his broad shoulder as if it weighed nothing. He set it down gently at her feet. The railway telegraph operator said a luxury cider company from London heard about the heritage harvest. They are offering double the market rate for exclusive rights to the russets. Beatrice looked down at the gleaming apples, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across her face. London. The very city that had chewed her up and spat her out was now coming to her, begging to buy the fruits of the land she had resurrected with her own bleeding hands. "Tell the telegraph operator to send a reply," Beatrice said, her voice ringing with the calm, unshakable authority of a queen ruling her domain. "Tell the London buyers they may come to inspect the harvest, but the price has just gone up. We do not sell cheaply to the city. Karma is finally catching up. Alistair's life is crumbling while Beatrice's empire is thriving. If you love seeing justice served, comment karma below." Gideon let out a low, appreciative chuckle. He stepped closer, his stormy gray eyes filled with absolute admiration. He reached out, his rough thumb gently stroking her cheek, completely uncaring of the workers buzzing around them. "You are a terrifying businesswoman, Mrs. Vance." "I am simply protecting what is ours, Gideon," she whispered, leaning into his warm touch. The first massive shipment of Briarwood heritage apples was loaded onto the train the following morning. The empire had officially begun. London was suffocating under a thick, relentless winter fog. For Alistair Vance, the grey dampness perfectly mirrored the absolute ruin of his once proud textile empire. The chaotic accounting, the terrible investments, and Clara's insatiable appetite for expensive jewelry had completely drained his reserves. He was sitting in the parlor of his London townhouse, a room that used to feel like a fortress of wealth, but now felt like a prison. The grand mahogany furniture had been discreetly sold off piece by piece to pay off the most aggressive creditors. Clara was upstairs, weeping dramatically because Alistair had forbidden her from attending the winter gala. They simply could not afford the carriage rental, let alone a new silk gown. Desperation had driven Alistair to the brink. He needed a massive loan to save his shipping contracts, and there was only one man in London wealthy enough to grant it: Lord Arthur Cavendish. Alistair had begged for a private meeting at the prestigious Sterling Gentlemen's Club. He dressed in his best remaining suit, trying to project an aura of confidence he no longer possessed, and walked through the biting cold to the club. Lord Cavendish was sitting by a roaring fireplace in a private leather armchair, surrounded by other wealthy investors. When Alistair approached, Cavendish barely looked up from his newspaper. "Vance," the Lord said, his tone dripping with polite boredom, "I have reviewed your proposal, and I must be brutally honest. Your business is bleeding from a dozen different wounds. Without your former wife managing the ledgers, your operation has become a complete liability. I will not throw my money into a sinking ship." The answer is no. Alistair felt the blood drain from his face. The room seemed to spin. "My lord, please. I just need a bridge loan to secure the spring imports. I can offer my townhouse as collateral." "Your townhouse is already heavily mortgaged, Alistair," Cavendish replied coldly, finally lowering his newspaper. "Everyone in the financial district knows it. Your ruin is the worst-kept secret in London. Now, if you will excuse me, I am trying to enjoy something genuinely valuable." Cavendish gestured to a silver tray on the small table beside him. On it sat a beautifully crafted crystal bottle filled with a rich, dark amber liquid. Beside the bottle were several slices of the most vibrant, perfect apples Alistair had ever seen. "Have you tried this?" Cavendish asked, pouring a small measure of the amber liquid into a glass. "It is a new luxury cider. The entire high society is completely obsessed with it. It arrived in London just 3 weeks ago, and the supplier can barely keep up with the demand. The flavor is incredibly complex. Heritage apples, grown in some remote, pristine northern valley. It costs an absolute fortune, but it is worth every single penny." Alistair stared at the glass. His mouth was dry. He desperately needed a drink, but Cavendish did not offer him one. Where does it come from?" Alistair asked, his voice hollow. Lord Cavendish picked up the crystal bottle, admiring the elegant gold foil label pressed onto the glass. "A private estate in the north. They resurrected an old, dead orchard, apparently. A brilliant piece of agricultural management. The estate is called Briarwood." Alistair stopped breathing. The name hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Briarwood. The dead, worthless, rotting farm he had thrown at Beatrice as an insult. It was impossible. It had to be a coincidence. "May I see that bottle, my lord?" Alistair asked, his hands trembling so violently he had to clench them into fists. Cavendish raised an eyebrow at the bizarre request but turned the bottle so Alistair could read the fine print at the bottom of the golden label. The words were printed in elegant, unmistakable script. "Briarwood Heritage Orchards. Sole proprietor, Mrs. Beatrice Vance." A ringing sound started in Alistair's ears. The opulent gentleman's club faded away. He stumbled backward, knocking into a heavy wooden table. Beatrice, his discarded, aging wife whom he had sentenced to freeze in the wilderness, had not perished. She had resurrected the dead land. She was the mastermind behind the most lucrative, sought-after luxury product in the entire city of London. She was becoming impossibly, staggeringly wealthy while he was drowning in debt. A sick, twisted sense of entitlement suddenly flared in Alistair's chest. That was his land. He had given it to her. Therefore the profits, the cider, the entire empire. It belonged to him. He convinced himself that Beatrice was simply a woman who had gotten lucky, and that she desperately needed a man of his experience to manage such massive wealth. Alistair didn't go back to his townhouse. He didn't say goodbye to the weeping Clara. He went straight to the train station and bought a ticket for the Northern Valleys. He was going to reclaim his wife, and more importantly, he was going to reclaim his fortune. The journey to the Northern Valleys was a miserable, bone-chilling nightmare for Alistair. He had been forced to travel in the cheapest, most crowded carriage, shivering in the drafty cabin as the freezing rain lashed against the windows. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the greedy anticipation burning in his chest. He spent the entire journey rehearsing his grand entrance. He would be magnanimous. He would tell Beatrice that he forgave her for her stubbornness, that Clara had been a foolish mistake, and that he had come to rescue her from the wilderness and take his rightful place as the master of the Briarwood estate. When the rented wagon finally crested the rocky hill overlooking the valley, Alistair prepared his most charming, condescending smile. But as he looked down at the property, the smile completely vanished from his face. This was not the rotting, cursed graveyard he had sent her to. Briarwood was a sprawling, magnificent empire. The massive stone and timber farmhouse had been masterfully restored, its roof pristine, its windows gleaming in the winter sun. Huge, newly constructed barns sat at the edge of the property, surrounded by dozens of workers loading heavy wooden crates onto horse-drawn wagons. The massive orchard stretched across the valley, meticulously pruned and incredibly healthy. The air smelled of wood smoke, fresh pine and sweet, crushed apples. Alistair stepped out of the wagon, his expensive leather boots sinking into the mud. He felt a sudden, terrifying wave of intimidation. He walked up the main path, dodging workers who barely gave him a second glance. He reached the wide, beautifully repaired front porch of the farmhouse. And there she was. Beatrice emerged from the front door holding a thick ledger. She was not the pale, broken woman he had discarded in London. She was breathtaking. She wore an impeccably tailored dress of deep burgundy wool. The physical labor had given her a vibrant, healthy glow. Her dark eyes were sharp, bright, and filled with an unshakable, terrifying confidence. She looked like a queen standing on the steps of her fortress. Alistair swallowed hard, forcing the charming smile back onto his face. He walked up the wooden steps. "Beatrice, my dear," Alistair said, opening his arms as if preparing for an embrace. "Look at what you have done. It is truly remarkable. But you don't have to struggle alone out here anymore. I have come back for you. We can return to London together, or I can manage the estate from here. I am ready to forgive the past." Beatrice stopped writing in her ledger. She looked up slowly. Her gaze swept over his mud-stained trousers, his tired, desperate face, and his hollow smile. She didn't look angry. She didn't look sad. She looked at him with absolute, freezing indifference. It was the look one gives a stray, unpleasant dog. "Forgive the past?" Beatrice repeated, her voice perfectly calm and smooth. "Alistair, you are trespassing on private property." Alistair's smile faltered. Anger, hot and ugly, began to rise in his chest. "Don't play games with me, Beatrice. I gave you this land. We are still legally married. What is yours is mine. This entire operation belongs to the Vance estate, and I am here to take control of it. This is the moment. If you are ready for Beatrice to absolutely destroy this arrogant man and claim her final victory, smash the like button right now. Type Queen in the comments." "You are mistaken," Beatrice said softly, stepping closer to the edge of the porch, looking down at him. "When you abandoned me for a girl half your age, you were so eager to dispose of me that you signed the deed over to my maiden name, Beatrice Sterling. Furthermore, my solicitors in London filed for a formal separation based on public abandonment and adultery 3 months ago. The judge granted it immediately, considering your very public humiliation of our marriage. You have absolutely no legal claim to my name, my person, or my land." Alistair stared at her, his mouth opening and closing in sheer panic. He had been so arrogant, so blinded by his own superiority, that he had handed her a completely ironclad deed. He had nothing. "Beatrice, please," Alistair stammered, his arrogance shattering into pathetic desperation. "The business in London. It is failing. I am ruined. Clara is draining me. I have nowhere else to go. You cannot turn me away. I am your husband." "You were a parasite," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, low register. "I built you from nothing, and when you felt powerful you threw me away. You sent me here to die. But I did not die, Alistair. I thrived. And I will not allow you to poison my home ever again." Before Alistair could speak another word, the heavy wooden door behind Beatrice opened. Gideon stepped out onto the porch. The massive, towering woodsman did not say a word. He simply stood behind Beatrice, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow over Alistair. Gideon's stormy gray eyes locked onto the smaller man, radiating a quiet, lethal warning. The message was clear. Take one more step toward her and you will not leave this valley walking. Alistair looked at the giant mountain of a man standing behind his former wife. He looked at Beatrice, who stood tall, unyielding, and completely victorious. He was beaten. He was utterly, devastatingly ruined. Alistair turned around, his shoulders slumped in total defeat, and began the long, humiliating walk back to the muddy road. Beatrice did not watch him leave. She turned back to her ledger, safe in the shadow of the man who truly valued her. Beatrice stood on the porch and watched Alistair's rented wagon disappear down the muddy, winding road. The heavy, oppressive shadow that had haunted her for 25 years vanished with it. She did not feel a sudden, overwhelming rush of adrenaline, nor did she feel the need to celebrate with grand gestures. What she felt was something far more profound: absolute, unbreakable peace. The sprawling valley of Briarwood Orchard was quiet, save for the distant, rhythmic sounds of the workers in the pressing barns and the gentle rustle of the autumn leaves. Gideon remained standing behind her. He had not relaxed his posture until the wagon was entirely out of sight. Slowly, the tension left his massive shoulders. He stepped forward to stand beside her, his stormy gray eyes studying her face with quiet concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his deep voice a soothing rumble in the crisp air. Beatrice turned to him, and a genuine, radiant smile illuminated her features. "I have never been better, Gideon. He came here expecting to find a graveyard, and instead he found a fortress. He will never return to this valley. He wouldn't make it past the ridge if he tried," Gideon stated simply, a promise etched into the hard lines of his face. The following morning, the reality of Beatrice's booming empire arrived at Briarwood in the form of a luxurious, velvet-lined carriage. It was pulled by 4 pristine white horses that looked entirely out of place on the rugged northern roads. From the carriage stepped Lord Arthur Cavendish, the wealthiest investor in London, accompanied by 2 nervous-looking clerks. Cavendish had tasted the Briarwood cider and, recognizing a gold mine, had decided to bypass his usual agents and travel to the source himself. Beatrice received him in the newly furnished parlor of the farmhouse. She offered him tea, sitting across from him with the perfect, unshakable poise of a woman who knew exactly what she held in her hands. Cavendish, accustomed to intimidating desperate merchants like Alistair, immediately attempted to take control of the conversation. "Mrs. Vance," Lord Cavendish began, leaning on his silver-tipped cane. "I am a man of direct action. Your cider is extraordinary. The London elite are completely captivated by it. I am prepared to offer you a staggering sum to purchase the Briarwood estate and the exclusive rights to the heritage trees. You could return to the city and live like a queen for the rest of your days." Beatrice took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea. She set the porcelain cup down on its saucer with a soft click. "I am already living like a queen, Lord Cavendish. And a queen does not sell her kingdom." Cavendish frowned, clearly taken aback. "Madam, the sum I am offering is irrelevant," Beatrice interrupted, her tone polite but entirely immovable. "Briarwood is not for sale. Not the land, not the trees, and not the pressing barns. However, I am a businesswoman. I am willing to grant you a 5-year exclusive distribution contract for the London territory. You will handle the transport and the city merchants. I will dictate the wholesale price per crate, and it will be paid in advance of every harvest. Take the terms, my lord, or I will telegraph your closest competitor this afternoon." Lord Cavendish stared at the beautiful, formidable woman sitting across from him. He let out a sudden, booming laugh, slapping his knee. "Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. No wonder Alistair Vance's business is collapsing without you. I accept your terms, Mrs. Vance." That evening, after the contracts were signed and Cavendish's carriage had rolled away, Beatrice sat at the large oak table in the kitchen. The ledgers were open, the fire was crackling warmly in the hearth, and the smell of roasted apples and cinnamon filled the air. Gideon walked in from the cold, hanging his heavy canvas coat on a peg by the door. Beatrice slid a freshly written legal document across the table. Gideon walked over, his brow furrowing as he looked down at the paper. It was a deed of partnership. It legally transferred 50% of the Briarwood estate and its profits into Gideon Black's name. He looked up at her, his pale eyes wide with shock. "Beatrice, I cannot accept this. This is your empire. You fought for it. You bled for it." "We bled for it," Beatrice corrected softly, standing up and moving around the table to stand in front of him. "When I was freezing in this ruined house, you fixed the roof. When I was drowning in dead wood, you brought the saw. I did not build this alone, Gideon. I have spent my entire life building wealth for a man who viewed me as property. I will not rule this valley alone. You're my partner. In the orchard and in my life. If you believe that true partners build empires together, leave a like on this video. Beatrice knows exactly who deserves to stand by her side. Gideon looked down at her, his chest rising and falling heavily. He reached out, his calloused hands gently holding her face. You honor me, Beatrice, he whispered before pulling her into a deep, fierce embrace. By late December, the northern valleys were plunged into the brutal, unforgiving grip of winter. But this year the freezing winds and heavy snows did not bring terror to Briarwood. The estate was a fortress against the cold. The newly constructed barns were thick and insulated, keeping the draft horses and the workers warm. The massive stone hearth in the farmhouse blazed day and night, fed by cords of dry, perfectly seasoned oak that Gideon had chopped months in advance. The pantry was overflowing with preserved meats, root vegetables, and jars of sweet apple preserves. A massive blizzard struck 3 days before Christmas, dumping 2 feet of snow overnight and completely cutting the estate off from the outside world. The sky was a swirling, chaotic ocean of white. But inside the farmhouse parlor, the atmosphere was a haven of golden light and absolute tranquility. Beatrice was sitting in a plush armchair near the fire, a thick woolen blanket draped over her lap. She was knitting a heavy scarf, the rhythmic click of the wooden needles harmonizing with the howling wind outside. Gideon sat on the thick rug near her feet, his massive back resting against the base of her chair. He was using a small carving knife to shape a piece of smooth cedar wood, the fragrant shavings falling onto a piece of canvas he had laid out. It was a scene of such profound domestic intimacy that Beatrice sometimes had to pause and remind herself it was real. For 25 years, winter in London had meant freezing in a massive, drafty townhouse while Alistair attended elite clubs, leaving her to balance ledgers in the dark. Now she was surrounded by warmth, safety, and the steady, comforting presence of a man who preferred sitting by her feet over any grand society gala. The wind sounds angry tonight, Beatrice murmured, her fingers deftly weaving the dark blue yarn. Gideon paused his carving, looking toward the frosted window panes. It is a fierce storm. But the roof is solid. The walls will hold. We are safe here. He set his knife down, staring into the dancing orange flames. A rare, melancholy shadow crossed his features. Beatrice noticed it instantly. She stopped her knitting and gently placed her hand on his broad shoulder. Where did your mind just go, Gideon? She asked softly. Gideon let out a slow, heavy breath. He reached up, covering her soft hand with his massive, calloused one. I was thinking about the first winter I spent on the ridge. A decade ago. I was alone in a cabin no bigger than a woodshed. I nearly froze to death, and part of me was hoping that I would. Beatrice's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in his voice. In all the months they had worked together, Gideon had never spoken of his past before arriving in the valley. What drove you to the ridge? She asked, her voice a gentle, non-judgmental whisper. Gideon closed his eyes. My wife, Sarah. My son. They caught the consumption during an outbreak in the southern counties. I was a strong man. I could fell a giant pine tree with an axe, I could build a house from scratch. But I couldn't save them. I sat by their beds and watched the sickness take them, and I was entirely useless. When they died, the world felt so loud and cruel. So I came to the quietest, coldest place I could find, and I decided to disappear. He turned his head to look up at her, his pale gray eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I lived like a ghost, Beatrice. For 10 years I was just a shadow haunting the tree line. Until I saw a woman dragging a heavy leather trunk through the mud, refusing to give up even when the entire world had abandoned her. Beatrice felt hot tears spill over her eyelashes. She slid off the armchair, kneeling on the thick rug beside him. She took both of his hands in hers, holding them tightly against her chest. Alistair told me that my life was over, Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. He told me I was too old, too useless to be loved or valued. He sent me here to fade away into the dirt. Gideon shifted, turning fully toward her. His massive hands reached up, gently wiping the tears from her cheeks. His expression was fiercely protective, filled with an adoration so pure it stole the breath from her lungs. Alistair Vance is a blind, foolish coward, Gideon said, his deep voice thick with emotion. You are the most extraordinary, magnificent woman I have ever known. You brought the dead trees back to life, Beatrice. And you brought me back to life with them. I love you. I have loved you since the moment you picked up that iron crowbar and refused to let the roof crush you. The moment we have been waiting for. If your heart is melting for Beatrice and Gideon, type "True Love" in the comments right now and smash the like button. Beatrice let out a soft, breathless sob. She leaned forward, burying her hands in his thick silver-streaked hair, and pulled him down to her. Their lips met in a kiss that was a decade in the making. It was not a frantic, desperate kiss of youth. It was deep, profound, and overwhelmingly warm. A promise of absolute devotion, forged in the fires of survival and the quiet peace of the northern valley. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside they had finally found their home.